All right, looks like we're live. So, thank you so much for joining this talk. This talk is on the business resiliency case, how to make that business case. I'm going to give you a couple case studies and how that works, and then we'll go from there. I am going to attempt to also be monitoring the chat channel. So if you guys have any questions around resiliency, let me know. If you got any questions around potatoes or bread, check the channel. I've already answered those. And I will be taking a break every couple of moments on the section breaks to catch up and see what's in there. My name is Wolfgang Goerlich. If you do not know me, I am an advisory CISO with Duo Security. I focus predominantly these days on the front end of identity and access management, SSO, passwordless, multi-factor, strong authentication, easy to use authentication. Before this, I did a lot of work in business continuity. I've given a lot of talks on the topic. I've written a lot about it. I really feel that it's an underlooked avenue for building security programs, and that's what I'm going to hopefully convince you of today. However, when the pandemic set in, the beginning of last year, when all this went down, I went and I talked to folks who I had helped. I talked to folks who I had worked with on their business continuity plans. I called out friends. I'm like, this would be great. This would be a great case study and how preparing can help get you ready for this. So I know that we have done work with the CDC's Zombie Preparedness Kit. I know we've done work with tabletoping with your executives. Tell me, my friend, how successful were you at shifting to remote work? How successful were you at handling what happened when the world shut down? And the answer wasn't good. to a person, everyone's like, "Oh yeah, we did do that, didn't we?" Even organizations that we had followed the CDC's zombie preparedness plan, which, if you are looking for a tabletop or a good way to mock out a pandemic, I recommend. Even those that we had done this with said, I remember we did the plan, but when it happened, we were too busy. We went into response mode. We reacted. We put places and things where they needed to go, and we did not necessarily follow those plans we made, which was disappointing, but not necessarily surprising. There's stats out of Gartner from 2020 that show that less than 14%, or about 1 in 10 organizations, are really able to do good BCDR. Not a good thing to be looking at. So in today's session, I'm going to look at 3 different business cases of how organizations firmed up, strengthened their resiliency programs. I'm going to define resiliency in just a moment. And then I'm going to look at where people go wrong. Specifically, after assessing nearly 200 organizations, what are some of the common themes that people keep doing wrong again and again, other than the normal one, which is, oh yeah, we did have a plan. That was cute. I remember that tabletop. It was fun. You brought in donuts. Other than that, where do people go wrong? So when I'm talking about resiliency, for the sake of today's conversation, I'm talking about technical resiliency. I'm not talking about self-resiliency. I'm not talking about supply chain resiliency. I'm not talking about organization. I'm talking about technical resiliency, which is a combination of recovery and continuity, disaster recovery, business continuity, a combination of that with incident response. When things go wrong, we act, and a combination of that with traditional IT problem management. So if it's a natural disaster, if it's an adversary who's doing something against us, or if it's simply because our tech doesn't work right, that's not a denial of service. We paid for that. If it's one of those scenarios, it can be tackled and handled with good, strong cyber resiliency. I hate the term cyber resiliency, but there we go. I'm about to tell you stories, and the stories you are about to hear are based on real life events. Just note that they're not necessarily representative of any particular organization, environment, friend, client, someone who might be on the stream, someone who might be on Discord, someone who might know me on Twitter. If you think this is about you, I promise it's not. We are not voiding any customer confidentiality, but this is summations of stories that are very representative of the real world today. So with that, let's look at the first business case, which is financial services. Let me take a quick sip of coffee. All right. In the beginning of this financial services company, they had some things going on. Their business continuity plan wasn't so much a plan as it was a culture. It was a nice culture, to be sure. It was a very pretty tree, and everyone knew who to call, except for it was a little bit outdated, maybe a year. And some people who were on the call tree had already left, but it was a very pretty tree, and it was very well formatted. The continuity program itself was run by an operations project manager who was designated as the BCDR manager. We'll get back to why this is a common theme, the delegation problem, and why I suspect a lot of ransomware is actually exploiting technical debt that accrues by delegating to the wrong level. That's a story for another time in this talk. There were exercises. They were definitely doing security exercises. They would be fire drills, and they were documented as tests. Now, that doesn't necessarily cover your tech stack, but at least exercise the call tree, and that was the state they're in. So a audit finding comes out. As you guys may know, in financial services, there's been a lot more interest as of late in business continuity and disaster recovery, not only in the organization that you're in, but also in the supply chain. So do you have a good handle on your critical applications? Are they tiered? Do you have a recovery strategy that goes along with those tiers? And for the apps that are outside of your purview, which is of course a growing number compared to where we're all at as we move everything to SaaS, for the apps outside your purview, have you also ensured that their business continuity and disaster recovery plan is up to date and meets your requirements? There's a lot of pressure there. So an audit finding happens, and the organization has to go and address that. Now, from a business continuity plan, the audit finding, from a business case perspective, the audit finding is one of our most powerful and yet dullest weapons, because you can't ignore an audit finding. You have to resolve an audit finding, right? If internal audit says you're wrong, now you've got a voice that goes up to the board, and you've got the ability to really push things forward and get things done. Awesome. The downside of that is, compliance being what it is, organizations are heavily incentivized to spend the least amount of time and effort to address that audit finding. Why would you? Why would you, right? Why would you just do anything extra? There's not necessarily any upside. And anyone who wants to tell me security has an ROI, I will say, let's have a great conversation over some drinks, because I always wonder about that. What is the ROI of an audit finding? In this case, it wasn't necessarily high. So the strategic contents was trying to address that audit finding and provide some basic high-level recovery tiering. Here's what we're going to do to keep systems up. From a financial perspective, there were certainly penalties associated with not resolving that as it moved to the external auditors. However, most of it was based on downtime versus recovery investment. So how much are we going to lose if something is down? That question, I think, is really paramount for an overall risk management program. What do we lose? What do we care if this piece of technology doesn't work? You ask someone that, ask an application owner that. What does it matter to you? And they'll go, it's important. Okay, put a dollar figure on that. All the dollars. Yeah. It can be very difficult in traditional risk management to really quantify downtime. It was easier in this organization because they could look at past outages, factor in what happens with penalties, with market moves and that so on, and really do a good model. So we need to nail down the financials. The stakeholders audit, already mentioned, the CFO, CIO, and CISO both reported up through the CFO in this organization. So there's a lot of focus on getting it done. And really the management approach was, how are we going to build this? How are we going to manage it? The management approach was, well, we'll build a new continuity recovery program, and we'll move that up out of project management, put it under the CISO, and we'll use this as a way to drive insights into our program. So when they execute it, that was the business case, right? Fix the audit findings, justified based on potential cost avoidance. Here's our key stakeholders. And what we're going to do, we're going to do some tiering, and we're going to rely on some IT infrastructure to do the recovery. When they went ahead and built that, one of the interesting things I liked about this is they developed a flexible strategy for multiple scenarios. The CFO was well known as saying, oh, plan for an asteroid crashing into the data center and totaling everything out. What do we do if the asteroid hits? Great question. Very unlikely. Also, what's surprising is if an asteroid hits and everything goes out at once, you may actually be in a better spot, right? If the asteroid takes out Amazon East, you may be in a better spot than if it's a rolling outage. Why? Because you don't have to worry about data corruption. You don't have to worry about data integrity. You have a point in time, that asteroid hit and is done. And it's a much easier recovery, surprisingly so, than if you've got multiple outages that you're trying to tackle, or worse, if you got an adversary who's working through your environment. So I'd almost rather face an asteroid, but given all those potential impacts, asteroids, fire, flame, pandemic, disconnected from the network, loss of site, loss of application, build out a grid and grouped all those into a few simple scenarios that allowed them to go ahead and execute recovery of their people or key applications or systems. Prioritize the processes and tier the assets, again, based on money value. Incredibly important. We'll get back to that when it comes to risk management and other things. And then use this process, the CISO use this process to have an ongoing conversation with the organization. I want to dovetail into a study we recently did at Cisco for just a minute. You can download if you want. I'm going to give you the highlights as they apply to resiliency. But Scientia Institute worked with us, talked to 48,000 people, and basically said, hey, of all the things you're doing and all the outcomes you have, what outcomes are you getting and what are you doing well? Then did the math behind the scenes and surfaced areas where people were doing these and seeing a whole bunch of outcomes that they reported, right? So the whole question of, does anything I'm doing in security matter? This is a very hard thing to answer. We got a little bit closer on by doing this exercise. So I'm going to pull out some of the things throughout this conversation that we found. We found that resilient organizations are much more likely to have the confidence of executive leadership. I think in terms of implementing that resiliency program I mentioned, in terms of implementing that program, I think that's because the conversation from the CISO perspective elevated from, I'm talking about this piece of technology, to I'm talking about what matters to organization. I'm talking about trading, I'm talking about account reconciliation, I'm talking about those things. And when you frame security in the lens of the business, security gets done. Good security is within context of the organization. But that's very hard to do if we don't know what all this stuff that we have means. So I suspect what's going on here with the finding that resilient organizations are of better confidence of the leadership is because they're speaking their languages. They're also more likely to keep up with the business. I also suspect that's because if you understand the business process level, what you need to do for good business impact analysis, if you understand it at that level, it's much easier to get in and delve in and help change processes or change technologies because you've got that understanding. There's a light bulb moment in this particular case where after we built the business case, built the program, we started feeding that program into different security capabilities. So for example, we're using that BIA to feed into the SIEM. We're using that BIA to feed into the vulnerability management program. So if I'm talking about patching a server to the CFO, I'm not necessarily talking about we need to patch a server. We're talking at the level of we're going to execute a change to protect the trading system. At the same time, if we're doing an investigation in the SIEM, we're not necessarily looking at a million different assets and trying to figure out what matters. We're prioritizing them based on what they matter to the organization, and therefore have a much clearer view into what investigations and alerts actually matter. And that gets to another finding when we did the correlation with 4,800 security professionals, is that organizations that are more resilient are also better at identifying and managing top risks. I suspect it's because those risks are put in context. If you think about a SIEM and you think about investigating, I remember just chewing up so much time in the early days. We were just throwing the logs at it, trying to get out an insight, trying to figure out what I need to act on. When we got the context of here's how this stuff, here's why it matters, here's what we're going to do about it, significantly easier. So that's the first case study, right? The outcomes of this were implementing recovery, implementing continuity, and using that to drive downstream efforts. I'm going to pop over to Discord real quick. Don't see any questions, so I am moving forward. All right, the next case study is a SaaS company. So they're building SaaS applications, and they're using traditional SaaS services to meet their customer needs. So continuity plan? What continuity plan? There really wasn't one. That wasn't a focus of the organization. They were predominantly focused on growing their apps, growing their customer base, growing their annual revenue, right, ARR, and really heavily focused on acquisition. They had shifted to a DevOps model. So DevOps was their delivery strategy, which meant, you probably have one security person for every 10 ops people, for every 100 developers. There's a lot of diffusion of security knowledge, a lot of diffusion of how things need to be built. The CISO was very focused on that problem, was very focused on co-level security. So could tell you about how we're doing SAS scans or DAS scans, what we're doing for our WAF. However, was not necessarily looking at the feature level or the availability level. And then there was an outage. It just so happened that the outage occurred during a very visible presentation where they're talking about the benefits of the program and doing a demo and everything, and it's out. You can't get at it. So we've got to build the business case here for this. Again, I'm going to talk about the strategic context, the financials, our stakeholders, and some of the downstream efforts that need to happen. So from a strategic context, the real primary driver is going to be around uptime, right? We know uptime is crucial for SaaS growth. You lose customers if you're down. You lose credibility if you're down. You get a lot of buzz off of Twitter, which is not good buzz to have when you're down. So that's really the overall context. The financials are going to be driven by that SRE function, right? That site reliability, the engineering function. What does it cost for us to be down in terms of delivering services? And not only direct cost, like in the previous example with the financial services, if we're down for an hour, we lose this much money, but also future leading costs, which is we notice that if we're down for an hour, that delays customer signups over the next 3 months. So a much more forward-looking model in terms of justifying investments in the recovery and continuity. The management approach had high availability and resiliency under DevOps. It had governance under the CISO. That was the approach they're going to take. Originally, HA wasn't really considered, well, we're in the cloud, it's all good, until it's not. So the management approach that they're going to take with this business case is to double down on SRE and HA under DevOps, and then establish and maintain a continuity and recovery governance model with the CISO. In doing this, it's a joint business case, right? It's a joint business case between the head of product and the head of security. The effort is to think about this in terms of like chaos engineering or other, unplanned outages. So not only from an overall holistic, let's keep the product up, but also from an individual, if this function fails, let's keep the product up. If that server fails, let's keep the product up. Let's make sure we have multiple availability zones in AWS, those sort of things. As well as tying that incident pipeline when we see something down and we need to act on it into a broader context. When they executed on this plan, a couple things came up. First was, and we see this in the data with the security outcomes, first was by doing this in partnership with the head of product and the head of security, we built really good peer support. The DevOps team knew that they needed to keep things up, and they knew why, and they felt that the security team was supporting them and giving them good guidance, not necessarily just waiting to point out, oh, you got a flaw in your code, fix that. Much better peer support. Likewise, the security team knew that the product people cared about availability and knew that by caring about availability, we can back into other security incidents and other perspectives. So they're able to create much better peer-to-peer support. And I think when we look at business cases that are predicated on compliance, as was the first example, very difficult to get well funded, and the emphasis is always on do as little as possible, as quick as possible to get this done as fast as possible. When we look at business cases that satisfy business need first, and here this was exactly it, right? Keep us up, keep our product going. When we look at business cases that satisfy business need first, and by satisfying that business need, provide security as a secondary outcome, those business cases tend to see significantly higher funding, greater peer support, and having a longer tail so that once you got it up and running, you don't forget that you got a plan and everything else. Another thing that's interesting about this was diffusing resiliency into the individual container level or microservice level meant that there was much lower unplanned work, right? Much less wasted effort. Why? Because when something happened, the system could self-heal. If they notice that, the way they set this up is if they notice that they're getting garbage on one of their APIs, for example, someone's sending in US dollars and it was supposed to be yen, or sending in a string when it was supposed to be a number, or attempting a SQL injection flaw, which never happens. Usually, when that happened, that was seen as a potential outage, and the host that was sending that information was identified, wiped, and reloaded using an Ansible playbook. So it made the environment, the entire environment, much more resilient. And when everything went wrong, we reset to normal and then went from there. Now, an interesting light bulb moment for me on this one was the fact that in a way, high availability leads to high security. There's some no use DIE concepts, right? If you haven't looked at DIE, it's well worth looking at. Distributed, immutable, ephemeral. If we can erase and rebuild an environment faster than an adversary can break in and stage tools, then we win because they can't get a foothold. And that was exactly what this organization found. They had a situation where they're running Kubernetes, and Kubernetes had that zero-day exploit, and there was a mistake in the networking, so that Kubernetes controller was exposed to the internet. Adversaries were exploiting that vulnerability right away, right? Moore's Law, HD Moore, not the computing. Moore's Law everyone had access to the exploit. Everyone was scanning and popping boxes like it was Christmas, and they would get popped the adversaries would stage tools. The adversaries would start to move laterally. That was identified as a potential problem with that Kubernetes node. The node was erased and reloaded from an Ansible playbook. The adversaries were kicked out. This happened a few times until they engaged the security incident management process. So if we can erase and rebuild faster than the adversary can break in and stage, we win. Awesome property in terms of ephemeral environments. It's probably why, too, resilient organizations are more likely to have streamlined incident response processes. I believe that's because we've thought through some of the ways things can break and have put in place playbooks and automation, and hopefully, wherever possible, are able to just execute these things and go. So that is the outcome of the SAS business case. They were able to integrate recovering continuity and IR. They were able to do it in partnership with the head of product and the head of security, with head of product maintaining that as a set of tools using DevOps and chaos engineering principles, and the security team maintaining the governance for that using traditional security concepts. Popping over real quick to look in the chat. Okay, so let's look at the next business case here. This one is in manufacturing. So there we were, right? they had a business continuity plan. That's a start. It wasn't necessarily aligned with ISO, which is the normal standards body for manufacturing, but they did have a plan. The plan put a emphasis on availability for manufacturing lines, manufacturing plants. So much like the financial services, where they put the emphasis on fire drills and tested those very rigorously, here in the manufacturing world, they had the emphasis on the plants and tested that very rigorously. Plant level recovery was great. It worked fantastic. Everything was good. However, that didn't necessarily take into account your knowledge workers and everything else. And due to acquisitions and due to the lack of a central asset inventory, they had 1,000,001 applications, lots of applications. They also had a roadmap for network refresh, so their equipment cycle was coming up. And they had a customer demand to meet a particular requirement for continuity and recovery. So in this organization, again, thinking about the context, the financials, the stakeholders, the business case was built around addressing that customer need, achieve TSAX compliance to be specific. So they needed to address that customer need. I'm very pro the customer use case, because if we're protecting customer revenue and expanding customer markets and everything by enabling the business through implementing security controls, what a great place to be in. There's much greater return. I think you could actually argue that is one of the few areas where security can't have an ROI. And there's much better budget and greater support across the organization for it. So I really like that context for a business case. Financials are based on that customer revenue. We know we need to satisfy this customer need, or we're going to be in a tough spot. The stakeholders are the heads of sales, the CIO, and the CISO. And the management approach for this was building a continuity recovery program under the CISO. So basically upskilling the current program, which was facilities-based, to include the IT assets. And in doing so, do a full multi-year business impact analysis where we look at all those apps, we look at all those resources, and we figure out what's what. Then the implementation of that technical implementation was going to be under the CIO as part of that network refresh budget. So when the refresh happened, taking advantage of that to shore up the network, shore up the infrastructure, and make sure they had good recovery and resiliency at that level. In doing this, they found a lot of different cost savings, not only in the refresh, but also coming out of the impact analysis. And they also position themselves very well to respond to future events. When they executed it, they standardized the plan. So they went back to fundamentals, they went back to the ISO standard, and they standardized the plan and made sure that it was lined up with the controls that were required by TSACs. Again, that was the driver, right? Get TSAC certified, keep the customers happy. In doing the business impact analysis, which was a multi-year analysis, looking at all the apps, figuring out what those 1,000,001 apps do, they noticed and identified a number of different redundancies. So opportunities to cut this app or cut that app, to get rid of this or that or the other, to simplify the environment, and to standardize the apps that the various plants and business operation units were using. So great opportunity to find a number of different areas to cut and consolidate. And they were able to use that those savings to then reinvest in the security program. So, right, I was mentioning business case should solve a business need first, and then satisfying that need, solve a secondary outcome. So in this example, the secondary outcome was identifying those cost savings and really rationalizing their application inventory, which is way out of control. Which gets to another finding that we see with organizations with good resiliency. They're much more likely to have a cost-effective program. Another light bulb moment for me occurred when a manufacturing line, after implementing this program, shoring up the BCDR, refreshing the network stack, beginning to consolidate apps, they actually faced a malware situation where the malware was spreading from plant to plant to plant. And it was those lines that were modernized and put in place for that customer need, which were unaffected. They were segmented off. They would see the traffic coming in. They would recognize that it was unwanted, unusual, abnormal traffic, and they would communicate back to the network environment, your network access control, and say, hey, isolate this, right? We don't want this traffic coming into us. And it kept the line up, certainly. But also what was fascinating about that is not only was those areas unaffected by this fast spreading malware, but it also became a detective tool in cleaning it up, because we could see when it hit these lines what was going on and what needed to happen. So it's another example of how major security incidents can be mitigated or minimized if you've got good resiliency in place. And a good example of how the security aspects of things, detecting when traffic is going awry, detecting when applications are going up, having a good application inventory, how those can all flow into a problem management state so that you can be able to respond very quickly, have the IT team know what they need to do, and feed those into the front line when we're actually tackling a problem. All right, so those are my 3 use cases. And I'm going to get into where people go wrong in just a minute as I pour myself a little more coffee. I see a comment in the chat. The third case is actually similar to where I am right now in healthcare. Customers demanding a new certification. Now, customer demands as a way of driving security is really one of my favorite ways of positioning things, because you get a lot of support, peer support from outside of just technology. And of course, when you're talking dollars with respect to customers, that was a major driver for revenue, for funding, for everything else, support and the culture, everything else. Question: what was the certification the plant was going for in a third example? TSAX, T-I-S-A-X, TSAX. TSAX is an exchange certification that is maintained. So if you are TSAX certified, other manufacturers can check that out and rely on that as a certification. So it's a good way to reduce your number of audits from customers. And it is based on the ISO standard. The certification body is out of Europe. All right, good questions. Okay, moving forward as I get back to my slides. Where do people go wrong? A couple years ago at CircleCityCon, I gave a talk and the clouds break. At that point in time, I was doing a lot of conversation, a lot of work around cloud continuity and recovery, because there was at the time, and I still feel there is a little bit today, that there was this thought that if you're on the cloud, you don't need to worry about continuity and recovery. It's fine. Everything is good. Someone else will take care of it. I recently did a podcast with W. Curtis Preston, and his book came out in May. So if you are in a SaaS position or you're looking to do good recovery work in that space, I'd highly recommend his book. I've been reading Preston for years. All his work is always very good, very thoughtful, very well constructed. So his book is just out. And thankfully, with his book and others, there's been a lot more attention on cloud data recovery. As part of that work and moving forward, this was in my previous role before joining Duo. As part of that work and moving forward, during my consulting days and time since that in the Clouds Break talk, my team had the opportunity to review 176 business continuity plans. So we read 176 continuity plans, so you don't have to. When I say that way, it kind of sounds like, those cheesy bots, like we made a bot read 1,000 different words and now we have it creating a Harry Potter script. It's like that. And as a matter of fact, I think I read that business continuity plan along the way. Here are some of the ways that these programs oftentimes go wrong. The continuity and resiliency efforts are owned by the wrong person. And I gave you the example of the financial services where it was owned by a project manager. I gave the example of the manufacturer where it was owned by plant operations. And I want to stress, both of those people are doing a great job at their level. Awesome. Fantastic. However, it's very common that we pass down these programs to junior folks. We delegate too low, and then we get concerns it's not being done right. When I was talking to Preston, again, the gentleman who wrote the book, W. Curtis Preston, and his book on cloud recovery, I was on his podcast, and he was complaining that backups are usually delegated to the most junior IT administrator. And I was pointing out that continuity and recovery plans are usually delegated to the most junior security analyst. And then what we do is we rely on these things, and when we need to recover and resume when things happen, it's just not there. And it's not for lack of trying. It's usually lack of them being equipped and having enough authority to execute. I suspect that ransomware, the spate of ransomware we've seen for 5-6 years now, is ongoing because we've got decades of technical debt that's accrued from delegating down too low. So number one failure, the wrong person. Number two is recovery at the wrong level. If you got front-end load balancers, that's not going to protect your back-end database. If you've got great recovery for your Amazon sites, but you've got a central source, an Oracle database that you're plugging into, you're not going to be protected that way. So there's wrong technology, load balancing, and site failures and everything that are not necessarily applied across the goal. And both of these, the wrong person, the wrong technology, are oftentimes not identified because we're doing the wrong testing. We got the wrong goals for testing. We got people who are doing these tests that don't necessarily apply, right? The fire drills, which have nothing to do with the data center. There's even more ways that we've seen this mucked up. Outsourcing is a big one. It's on a cloud provider. Cloud provider handles it all. They don't. Make sure they're testing your stuff, because they don't. Non-standard language, not using the right terms, right? The RPO and RTO being confused are really good signs that this is a plan that was not written the right way. Non-standard approach. I'm not saying we need to file NIST or ISO 22301. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that if you're a NIST shop or ISO shop, you're in a much better place if you follow these standards and make sure you're addressing these controls. There is a time and place to build a custom program, but the time and place is oftentimes not in the resiliency, where you need something very standard, very portable, that can be handed from team to team or organization to organization. Trying to address this high availability. It's cool. We got HA. All right. Have you tested it? Is everything in HA? What happens at the failover point? What about data corruption? And that, back to that asteroid falling, that was one of the most painful experiences of my life, was when I was handling a disaster recovery scenario. It really was the asteroid, if everything's down, we're good. But they had a series of rolling failovers. So you had corrupt transactions that had to be rolled off. You had file mismatches. You had file systems that would mount. Oh, this is terrible. Not going to be protected with HA. Overly broad plans. Yeah, it's in the cloud provider. We got it. Don't look at what's in the data center. Overly specific plans. We know exactly what we will do for COVID the next time it hits. Okay, but what about any other pandemic or any other widespread impact to your workforce? We will give PPE and we'll give people their COVID vaccines. It's black swan events are black swan events for a reason. They almost never occur. So building a plan for a black swan event is a terrible idea. Yet everyone is doing it right now. Why? Because we're still emerging from COVID. Much better is to say, let's build a plan for something that's swan-shaped, like an unnamed goose. If we got an unnamed goose plan that can address a whole bunch of bird-shaped things, we're in a good spot. That's what you want to aim for. But all too often, it's overly specific. Handled in isolation, so there's different asset management, different risk rankings, not tied in with the overall programs. So these are the main ways that these things get mucked up. Comment is, it's usually called the backup team, not the backup and recovery team. Too true. Recover? Test the recover? Why? Why should we? Is the problem with the cloud that people never test their backups, or that they configure their availability incorrectly, or something else? Great question. The problem with the cloud is a couple things. One, organizations often don't think to back up. It's in the cloud, it's running. Why should I have to worry about a backup? Well, because things go wrong. Well, but we've got multiple cloud instances. Okay, but what happens when multiple of those go wrong, or when you get corrupted data, such as ransomware? So in part, it's because they don't do backups. If they do backups, another aspect of the problem is that a lot of cloud software, being open source, doesn't necessarily do full encrypted backups. So working with a company recently in an advisory capacity, and we're talking about backups, like, oh yeah, I think we've got that configured, but we can't do a incremental backup, and we can't encrypt our backups without buying the commercial software version. Ugh. Yeah, they must never have had an EC2 instance stop or fail or lose their ephemeral storage. Correct. You don't really think about these things until something terrible happens. All right, let's talk about moving from recovery to resiliency. One of the key things that recovery allows you to do is know what matters and know what to do about it. That is the most important part about this, doing the impact analysis, mapping out your processes, mapping out your assets. From there, we can go ahead and plug in resiliency into a couple of different places. I love to see it plugged into the SOC or the NOC. So this asset means this. It's supporting this business process. It's our key business process. In healthcare, it's protecting our patients' health and safety. In financial services, it's what's allowing us to trade. It's our key process. We want to prioritize in the SOC or the NOC those processes accordingly. Same thing, feed that into the CERT. Same thing, feed that into the GRC, and have those back flowing too, right? So when your GRC program is updating risk rankings or making recommendations across all three areas, we've got a similar understanding of what this stuff means and what we need to do about it. A surprising finding when we were looking at 4,800 security professionals, what they do and what they get, surprising finding was that folks who are doing resiliency were more likely to retain top talent. You wouldn't think that would be true, right? Because backups and recovery are boring and documentation is boring and everything that I talk about is usually boring. So why is that? Why is it? Well, when you look at people who worked in IR or in SOC and have burned tons of time trying to solve a problem because they noticed unusual traffic, only to realize that that was a new application, or they noticed some very specific, suspicious activity, only to realize that was on a guest network that no one cares about. How many times can that happen before you're like, this place is a garbage fire, I'm going to go get another job? If you do work in security, you want your work to count and to matter. So you need a way of making sure that happens. Some other additional integration points. I already mentioned SIEM and vulnerability management. I really like to feed these things into your PIM and PAM programs. So this high secure environment is only accessible through just-in-time access. Data loss prevention, certainly with classification. UEBA, certainly so that we know the behavior is right. Now, the trick to this is to look at all these and look at what's mature and what's available to you and make that integration point. The caution I would give is don't say I can't do BCDR until I've got good UEBA, or I can't do PIM and PAM until I got good DR. We want to mature what we can, but for the portions, the capabilities that are running well and running mature, link those up together to provide an overall unified view. And also remember not to separate resiliency from the organization. I'm talking predominantly today about resiliency as an IT function and therefore a part of the domain of cybersecurity. But of course, resiliency affects more than IT. We want to start with the business case for continuity and recovery and response. Start there. Be very careful not to silo it off from other broader initiatives. From there, exercise, and not just fire drills. I've got an exercise maturity model I've shared before. I'll cover it again here briefly, but you want to start off with, here's our story. Something's down, whatever, and have those stories on an ad hoc basis, maybe over team meetings, open office hours. Level 2, you want to firm up those scenarios, those stories into scenarios, and do a formal tabletop with the right people. And not only would just do the technical one, but also business facing and with your peers so that you can make sure that you've got good understanding of what needs to happen. Now that you're doing that on a regular basis, maybe that's a quarterly, maybe that's monthly, take some of your best scenarios, tie them to very specific tactics and controls, and test those tactics and controls technically. From that, we want to line it up to an overall framework and run those exercises in parallel. So you not only do the tabletop, but introduce evidence, turn things off, flip over tables, whatever it takes to make sure that things are working. And then as we go to level 5, automate the heck out of it, right? Think of the chaos monkey and the work that's being done and chaos security engineering, where this is an ongoing process that's automated and regular and allows us to do continuous improvement. From there, we want to measure our performance from business impact analysis to increasing the number of our scenarios, to increasing the number of tactics that we've got, traditional metrics like RTO, how long it takes to recover, RPO, what point you're recovering to, and restoration after recovery, as well as IR, time to detection remediation. So measure your progress and make sure that you're driving that up. The measurement really comes at about level 3. It's not where you start, it's where you're going. All right, I'll conclude this and then I'll answer any final questions in the Discord, and then we're done. The next time you're in a building, next time you're in an elevator, I'd encourage you to look down. See which elevator it is. It's probably an Otis. It might not be an Otis. but it probably isn't Otis. The story of the elevator is actually a security story. Otis comes from the man Otis, the gentleman who's the namesake of those elevators, and he didn't actually invent the elevator. No, he didn't. He invented the brake, and he would go out in the 19th century. His name was Elisha Otis, who would go out in the 19th century, and he would have people with ropes pulling them up 2, 3, 4 stories in the air on a platform, and have a big crowd around him. There wasn't much to do in the 19th century. We didn't have Twitter. So he would crowd around to see this guy who was about to break his neck. And then they would cut the rope, and he would fall on this makeshift elevator, sometimes as much as a story, until the automatic brake kicked in. Otis Elevator, named for the Elisha Otis, who never did die from these stunts, surprisingly enough. Otis Elevator Company patented the brake in 1913. And it was about 20 years after that we started seeing some crazy tall buildings, including the Empire State Building and everything else. The security control, the brake, was what allowed us to reach for the sky. So that enabled the last great migration, where we moved from country to city, where we moved from the first floor to the top floor. A lot of interesting stories in there, but it was the last great migration. Till this migration, the migration we're in now, we moved everything not from one place to another, but from physical to virtual. And as a matter of fact, if you look at where most people today are building their companies, building their lives, it's online, right? It's all online. Why I bring that up is we're in the midst of the greatest migration of our lifetime, the first migration that's been largely physical to virtual, and that puts incredible importance on resiliency. Resiliency is that elevator brake. Resiliency, the resiliency we're building today, that resiliency is what's going to make possible tomorrow's wonders. It's going to be really fascinating to see what happens 10 years from now. So moving forward, look at ways to build the business case. I've given a couple of examples today. Make sure you gap assess your programs and figure out how to integrate them, continuity recovery, IR, problem management, and determine what areas need investment. Close those gaps, run exercises, use that to drive up your program, and do it. And don't forget to do it, because the zombies are coming. And if we don't run our zombie preparedness plan, what the heck will we do? All right, let me look one more time for anything left in Discord. There's a comment that a lot of the problem with cloud is the issue of the recovery process itself. It says, well, I do love Terraform. I found many devs will often not take backups into account. Exactly, they don't. They're trying to build stuff, right? Their whole idea is not let's put brakes in the elevator. Their whole idea is let's build the tallest building. That's why we need to be thinking about the brakes. And most people don't understand what offline backups mean. Yes, so true. So when you think about some of the more advanced ransomware tactics, what do? They compromise your backups first. There was a very interesting one that was going out and tackling MSPs. So compromise an MSP, push out a command to delete all the backups, push out a command to disable AV on all the endpoints, and push out ransomware to all the endpoints. So yeah, most people don't really have an understanding of backups. And backups, disaster recovery, instant response, these are not necessarily things that people can just read up on the internet and jump in and do. It really does require a degree of expertise, and it requires a degree of experience to get it right. All right, I know I'm at time, so thank you all very much for joining today. I hope you've had a good time in this session, and I hope you have fun with the rest of the conference. Cheers.